121. This is our last message in the series on the Psalms, discussing how we can take every thought, every emotion into the presence of God. And we can read the very joyful, rejoicing Psalms. We can read the Psalms that are lament Psalms, where the psalmist is in pain. We can look at the Psalms where the psalmist is questioning God. And if you've never questioned God, you've never really lived all of what life has to offer here on this planet. Because there will be times when life does not make sense. I guarantee you that. And the wisdom literature tells us that. The psalm, as you read earlier this morning, is a very brief one. It says, I will lift up my eyes to the mountains. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. He will not let your foot slip. He who watches over you will not slumber. Indeed, he who watches over Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. The Lord watches over you. The Lord is your shade at your right hand. The sun will not harm you by day, nor the moon by night. The Lord will keep you from all harm. He will watch over your life. The Lord will watch over your coming and going, both now and forevermore. I like movies, lots of them. Some of them I don't like. But a lot of them I do. And I'm to the point now where, the older they are, the better, right? I mean, could you ever do better than Casablanca? I mean, seriously, And don't colorize it either. Just leave it black and white. It's what it's supposed to be. It was made with that idea in mind. But there are all sorts of movies that I like. One of them is The Sound of Music. Okay? And some of you are very familiar with that, doe, a deer, a female deer, and all that sort of stuff, I think one of my favorite songs that Maria sings is I've Got Confidence. Not one we think about very often, but that's a nice song. In the movie The Sound of Music, there is a key moment. It is when Captain Von Trapp has been told that he is going to be going to a ship that is part of the Nazi fleet, the Third Reich, and that he has no say in this matter. However, he does manage, and you know the story, to appear with his children, unplanned that he would appear with his children at the Salzburg Festival, where they sing and perform, and they win first prize and all that. And what you find out is that they have used that as a cover to slip out so that the Nazis will not be able to take him and force him to serve in Hitler's Navy. Well, as they hide out, they go to the local nun's place, I guess, rectory, whatever it is, where the nuns go, where the nuns are trained, and the abbey, that's it, sorry. That word just flew out of my head for a minute. They go to the abbey and they hide out there, which of course is the abbey that Maria was a part of until she became a governess for the children and eventually married the captain. And so the plan is, okay, how is the captain and how are the captain and Maria and the children supposed to get out? And, we'll take off. We'll go, no, you can't do that. All the roads are closed. I've listened on the radio. Okay? So the plan is, the plan, it turns out, is for them to hike over the mountains, over the hills, the high hills, and to go into Switzerland, which is a neutral country, and there they can find safe haven, sort of like refugees, if you will. All right? Now, what's interesting at this point in this musical, I don't want to ruin the musical for you, okay? But I watch things with a discerning eye, I guess, in mind. And at one point, the Reverend Mother says, I have a solution to your problem. The roads are all closed, but the psalmist says, I will lift up my eyes to the hills from whence comes my help. Right? In other words, your help is the hills. You can climb over the hills and go into Switzerland, and you'll be safe from the Nazis. They won't be able to get you there. Nice sentiment, beautiful movie, wonderful last scene with everybody climbing the mountain, and the helicopter showing the picture, and it's a gorgeous view. But the dear Reverend Mother has misunderstood the first verse. Okay? And I'll say more about that in a minute. Just hang on to that thought, okay? I'm sure she's a fine lady. She sings very well, I'm sure she runs a tight ship at the Abbey, but anyway, I'll tell you in a minute, okay? Now, a little bit about Psalm 121 first before we get back to that. Psalm 121 is one of what is called in the Bible, and you'll see this in your Bible. It's called the songs or the psalms, same thing. Psalm is the Greek word for song. Songs of ascents, meaning climbing up. ascending, right? Psalms 120, 136, okay? The Mishnah connects these psalms. The Mishnah is a book of Jewish tradition and Jewish teaching. Big old long series of, it's a series of notes on the Torah is what it is, okay? It connects these 15 steps, the 15 steps of the temple where the Levites would sing these songs. So they would start on one step and sing Psalm 120, and the next one sing 100. That's supposed to be Psalm 134, by the way. And they would just do, and we don't know, that's a possibility. It's more likely, though, that these psalms were sung by people as they made their annual trek up to Jerusalem. Many people would go to Jerusalem for Passover. We know from the book of Acts, chapter 2, that many of the Jewish people from all over the Roman Empire went to Jerusalem for Pentecost, which was a feast that was held 50 days after Passover. Pentecost is not just a New Testament phenomenon, it was a feast that was observed in the Old Testament as well. And as they would go on the trip, they would sing. It's sort of like, when you go on a long trip with a family, you try to find, nowadays everybody's got a device, right? So nobody talks to anybody, because we just all are device, involved, okay? But we would sing songs, And you'd sing songs to pass. Okay, what's a song that starts with A, okay? Let's sing of a hymn starting with A. How about B? How about, it got really hard with Q and X and Z and stuff like that, Well, Z, there's probably something with Zion in it. Or else, if you didn't do that, maybe you sang, 99 bottles of beer on the wall, just something to pass the time, right? Well, that's what the idea was here. We're going to Jerusalem, and we're ascending up, because Jerusalem's built on a hill. Jerusalem is over 2,000 feet above sea level, and it's quite high up, and it's very prominent. And so they would sing as they would see the Jerusalem, and perhaps see the temple in the distance for some time. It might take them a few hours to get there, but they would see it. And so as they were going along, they would sing these psalms. And Psalm 121 is likely one of the psalms that they sang. Well, it is part of this Psalm of Ascents. Now here are the themes that come through in this particular psalm that are found in these four major sections of Psalm 121. The first one is that Yahweh, that's a Hebrew name for God, we usually say it in English as Jehovah or the Lord, is the Creator. Now this is very important because we understand that, we take that for granted. Now the idea of God being the Creator in our culture is sort of juxtaposed against the idea of evolution. That was the farthest thing from the minds of people in antiquity. The whole idea of evolution really didn't come about until about 1865 with Charles Darwin's book, Origin of Species. But they would have other views. In fact, many of the cultures surrounding Israel had a belief that creation was a process. It was a battle. It was gods fighting each other, and in one, in one epic, there's the god Tiamat and the god Gilgamesh. There's a big fight that takes place, and Tiamat loses, and so Tiamat is then cut up into pieces, and each of those pieces are used to make the world. So this piece of Tiamat makes the sun, this piece makes the stars, this piece makes the earth, this piece makes the water. This is where the sort of liberal theologian idea that we all have a little bit of the divine spark inside of us. That's where that comes from. It doesn't come from the Bible. The Bible says we're made in the image of God, but it doesn't say that we're divine. Right? It's a big difference. Okay? But the Lord is the creator. How does the God of the Old Testament create? He doesn't create by fighting other gods. This is not like a cosmic cage match or something like WWE Raw, where all the gods get together and they wrestle and fight, and the last one standing gets to do whatever he wants. No, this is the God of Israel, who is the God of the universe. And he simply says, let there be light. There's light. Well, let there be a firmament between the waters above and waters below. There it is. Okay? And this goes on and on. This is a God who creates out of total sovereignty and total control. Now, if God is in total control, what does that mean for you and me? What does that mean for you and me? If God is really the creator, if he is the only creator, right? He is also not only the creator, he's the guardian of Israel. We saw this in one of the earlier Psalms, that God is the creator, he's also the covenant-making God. And not only that, but he is your guardian, you, right? This psalm becomes very personal, that the Lord watches over you. He looks at you, and cares for you. And finally, the psalm ends with a blessing from that same Lord. So the God who created the universe is the God who watches over you. He's the guardian of God's people. He's the guardian of you, and he is the God who blesses you. That's a pretty good deal. I like that. That my God is the God who created all the universe, and having created all the universe, he watches over his people, and he watches over each one of us, and he has a blessing for us. It doesn't get any better than that. So that's what we're dealing with here. Let me look just briefly at a few thoughts here in the time that we have left. First of all, there is, and this is where the dear Reverend Mother, I don't think quite got the point, and I love The Sound of Music, and I will watch it again. The Reverend Mother will not keep me from watching The Sound of Music again, okay? When my wife was in college, they used to show it in the, this was back in the days when, there was just television, and they just had one television that was in the lounge in the women's dorm that my wife was living in, and I walked in and to pick her up one time. We were going someplace, and there's, 30 or 40 young women there watching The Sound of Music, and there wasn't a dry eye in the house. Well, there were two, but I mean, that's because but it just was, it's such a powerful thing, okay? The contrast in verses 1 and 2 is this. It is between the hills, which is where the danger dwells. When you're making your way up to Jerusalem, remember the story that Jesus told about a man who went down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among thieves, and he was beaten half to death? This was not an uncommon thing. There were all sorts of bandits and threats and wild animals, right? Jesus goes out into the desert during his temptation, and Mark is the one who adds the little detail that he was with the wild beasts. Right? So the hills are the place of danger, but it is the Lord who gives help. Right? So the question is, I will lift up my eyes to the mountains. That's not a good thing. If I'm going to get to where I need to go, if I'm going to get to the house of the Lord, I have to navigate the hills. And that's a scary proposition, because I don't know who's hiding out in the hills. I don't know who's laying low in there to sort of take me down. I don't know who's up there to beat me within half an inch of my life and just leave me there to die or to be eaten alive by the hyenas and the various other animals that populate that part of the land of Israel. That's not a good thing. And so the question then comes, well, where does my help come from? If I see these hills in front of me, where does my help come from? And then he says, my help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. My help doesn't come from the hills. That's where the danger lies. But my help comes from the Lord who gets me through the hills. My question to you is, what hills are you going to encounter this week? It seems to me there's two kinds of hills that you and I encounter. One is the typical ones, right? You go to work, same old struggles, same old challenges, maybe the same old opposition. Oh, here comes so-and-so. Here comes the preacher. Here comes a Jesus freak, whatever. That's what they used to use the term. That was a term that was used both for personal encouragement, as well as it was a term that was thrown at Christians. You're a Jesus freak. What hills are you going to? So there's the hills you're going to encounter, the hills that are typically going to be there, the challenges that are there. But then there are the hills you don't expect. It was mentioned this morning that our brother Tom has some hills to climb. And we all do. In fact, he and Gail both are challenged. And the rest of us. And we prayed for them for a long time. And I'm going to add one more to our prayer list this morning when I'm finished here. What are your hills? I want you to hear this, okay? I want you to know that whatever your hills or your challenges are, that the Lord is the creator of heaven and earth, and he is with you. Doesn't mean that everything's going to go as smoothly as you like, but it means that you will ultimately be cared for. God has not forgotten about you, okay? The Lord is your maker. He is the source of your help. There are no other gods. This is a message that resounds throughout the Old Testament. There's only one God, and that is the Lord, the God of Israel. The other so-called gods, and Paul addresses this issue, for example, in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, when he talks about, there are idols, there are stone idols, and they're not really gods at all. Now, there are sort of demonic presences that dwell behind them, but they're not gods. And Isaiah mocks the people of Judah who think that they can serve other gods, who think they can actually take a tree and cut it down and take part of it and carve out a god and then, worship the god. Okay. In fact, at one point in his prophecy, Isaiah says, you cut down a tree and you use half of it to make an idol, and you use the other half for kindling wood, for firewood. I've mentioned this before, but it's been a while. Okay. And then Isaiah asks the question, he says, what if you got the two halves of the tree mixed up? What if you accidentally took your God and used your God for firewood, and then you're worshiping what was supposed to cook your dinner? In other words, he's sort of making fun of those who would place their faith and trust in anything but the great God of Israel. The Lord is your maker. He is the source of your help. There are no other gods. So my question right there in the middle of that slide is, what hills are you going to encounter this week? Some of them we probably know about. Maybe some we don't. But let's pray for each other and encourage each other, because we're all going to face them. We all have those times when we go to the doctor and we're concerned, and he says, oh, it's nothing. Here, take this pill, It's just, but there's going to be that time, eventually, when the doctor says, yeah, this is really serious. It's going to happen eventually, right? So what hills are you and I going to encounter this week, both known and unknown? How do we get through those? The Lord, our Maker, He is the source of our help. There are no other gods. The Lord, the guardian of Israel, is your guardian. This is what the psalmist says. In verse 3, he says, He will not let your foot slip. Okay. That's important when you're climbing a hill. Okay. There is no shortage of videos on YouTube of people taking nasty and horrible falls, right? I don't know why people get such a jolly out of watching that, watching people completely wreck themselves physically, Ha, ha, ha. You fell 2 stories and landed on your head. Ha, 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 If you're climbing the hills and your foot slips, that's not a good thing. He will not let your foot slip. He does not slumber, nor does he sleep. Verse 3, He watches over you. He who watches over you will not slumber. Indeed, who watches over Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. Did you know that some of the gods of antiquity, some of the gods of the nations surrounding the people of Israel, those gods actually slept? And you better not bother that God while they're sleeping. You think your dog gets grumpy when you wake him up. You imagine waking up your God who is sleeping, and you piddly little no-account nothing. How dare you disturb my sleep? I was down at my son and daughter-in-law's for the birthday party for our grandkids back in June, okay? And I'm laying on the couch, just kind of resting, and I apparently dozed off to sleep. And the next thing I knew, I was awakened rather abruptly from sleep by the dog licking my face. Fortunately, my mouth was not open at the time. It was like, Calvin! Okay. My son and daughter-in-law both went to Bethel College, which is an Arminian college, and they'll tell you that, okay, in terms of their theology. And they named their dog Calvin. It's a theological joke. Ask me if you want an explanation afterwards. I'll explain it to you. Need it. Irony, okay? God doesn't sleep. I sleep. Some nights I sleep better than others, just like you, right? I spent a night last week in Grand Rapids at our condo in Grand Rapids, and we live on a cul-de-sac, okay? So there's no motorcycles going through, And so I hear that. It wakes me up sometimes. But when I went home, it was quiet. Really nice. Okay, it's really nice. I get used to this, But think about it. Just think how vulnerable you are when you're sleeping. You're sleeping and the phone rings, or you're sleeping and you hear a knock at the door. at 3 in the morning. It's rather disconcerting. But when you're asleep, there's not much of anything you can do. But your God doesn't sleep. He doesn't have to sleep. He doesn't slumber. He doesn't sleep. He doesn't hang out a do not disturb sign. We can go boldly before the throne of grace whenever we need to. The Lord watches over you. He is the shade of your right hand. Neither the sun nor the moon will harm. This is some interesting language, okay? He is the shade over your right hand. The Bible has a lot to say about what it means to be under the shadow of God's protection. The shade of your right hand, most people in antiquity were right-handed. It was pretty standard. So the right hand that's what you do, you know. You ever have those times when you're writing and all of a sudden, maybe you sprain your wrist and you have to write with your left hand. If you're right-handed, it's really messy. And vice versa. History has not always been real nice to left-handed people. Did you know that the Latin word for left is sinister? It is. Okay? It was thought at one time, a long time ago, that being left-handed was not normal, that it was an aberration. I had a Latin teacher in high school who was our retired principal who was left-handed, and he told stories about how he would be writing his lessons, and the teacher would come by and grab his left hand, take the pen out of his left hand, hold up his left hand, and whack him across the hand with a ruler, and place the pen in his right hand. Don't write with your left hand. That's even before my time. Okay? It didn't work because he was left-handed, but that's not what this is saying. This is not an insult to left-handed people. This is saying that in the general scheme of things, what is your life all about? How do you proceed? How do you go forward? That God is the protection. He is the shade for you. Neither the sun nor the moon will harm you. That's day and night. Okay? During the daytime, during the nighttime. I'm not going to let those things harm you. Okay? A couple of passages I noticed, and this is on the note so you can have this. In Psalm 91:1, we are said that we rest in the shadow of the Almighty. That sort of protection. God watches over us. We rest in his shadow. In Numbers chapter 14 and verse 9, the enemy's protection is gone because the enemy doesn't serve the Lord, and so the Lord's protection is not with your enemy, but it is with you. Okay. Finally, this psalm ends with a blessing, verses 7 and 8. It says, "The Lord will keep you from all harm. He will watch over your life. The Lord will watch over your coming and going, both now and forevermore." Now, this is important for us to understand this. This is not a guarantee that things will always go perfectly well for us. What it is a guarantee of is that God is always watching over us. And the statement here is that the Lord will watch over your coming and going, both now and forevermore. Remember, the great hope of the psalmist is, "I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever." This is the expectation. This is what it means for God to bless us. It doesn't mean, and we see that elsewhere in Scripture, we see it elsewhere in the Psalms, right? It doesn't mean that we are not going to be challenged at times. It doesn't mean that we're not going to suffer. It means that God is always with us. Even in times of trial and tribulation and pain and persecution, there are lessons that can be learned. Denny sang it very well this morning when he sang the Andre Crouch song. If I never had a problem, I'd never know that he could solve them. It's sort of like exercise, you know? Is exercise fun? Sometimes. Sometimes not. Is it good for you if done in proper proportion? Yes. Is it really a necessary part? Absolutely. There's all kinds of benefits for exercise. Is it always fun every moment you're doing it? No. So when God allows trials and difficulties to come into our lives, so we lift up our eyes, we see the hills. The hills are still there. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord. He's the creator. He is the one who watches. He is the covenant-making God. He is the one who has redeemed us. He is the one who is not only the guardian of Israel, but he's the guardian of you and me. And he watches over us. And he blesses us. The Lord will keep you from all harm. He will watch over your life. The Lord will watch over your coming and your going, both now and forevermore. What hills are you facing this week? Tomorrow, maybe you have to work when nobody else does, you know. Tomorrow's Labor Day. Okay, we call it that. Nobody works, but we call it that in honor of labor and the movement of labor in this country. Maybe you have to go into work. That's true of people that work in convenience stores. That's true of people who work in hospitals. But when Tuesday gets here and we kind of get back into things in the full bore of the fall season, more or less, the unofficial end of summer, it's always sad to say those words. What hills are you going to encounter? What challenges are you going to face? I don't know the answer to that, but I know that God will be with you. I mentioned Tom and Gail earlier. Barb, it's good to see you here this morning as well. I know you told me you're feeling better today, and you've had some health challenges, and there are others as well. I'm reluctant to mention anybody because I know I'll leave somebody out.